I thought I was flying to my dream wedding until the Internal Security Service raided the plane and accused me of a heavy crime. The gift from my fiancé wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a trap to frame me for an organized scheme that would cost me dozens of years. I've always been a person who relies on logic, data, and cold, hard facts. To me, destiny is just something people talk about when they're too lazy to take responsibility for their own choices. And psychics are nothing more than clever actors who specialize in reading body language. So when that woman with the clouded eyes and the smell of stale incense grabbed my wrist at the airport coffee shop, my first instinct wasn't fear, it was irritation. I was 30 minutes away from boarding a flight to Phuket to finally reunite with Mark, the man I was going to marry, and I didn't have time for local eccentrics. "Don't board the Silverbird, child," she hissed, her grip surprisingly strong for someone who looked like she'd crumble in a light breeze. "The gift you carry is a tether, and the destination is a cage. If you fly today, you will lose your name before you lose your life." I laughed. I actually laughed right in her face. I pried her fingers off my arm, adjusted my designer carry-on, and told her she should try her routine on someone who hadn't already spent $5,000 on a non-refundable first-class ticket. Mark had been in Thailand for 6 months, setting up what he called a high-end boutique export business. And this trip was supposed to be the start of our forever. He'd sent me the ticket, a stunning emerald engagement ring, and a list of all the things we'd do once I landed. I was living the dream, and no prophetic warning was going to ruin my mood. The boarding process was seamless. As I sat in the plush leather seat of the first-class cabin, sipping champagne, I thought about the gift the woman had mentioned. The only thing I was carrying that wasn't mine was a small sealed wooden box that Mark's business partner Leo had handed to me at the terminal. Leo had met me near the check-in desk, breathless and apologetic, saying Mark wanted me to bring this specific vintage clock for their new villa. It was beautifully wrapped, heavy, and smelled faintly of sandalwood. It seemed like a perfectly normal, romantic gesture, but as the plane leveled off at 30,000 feet, a strange sensation began to crawl up my spine. It started as a tingle and grew into a heavy, oppressive weight in my chest. I looked at the wooden box tucked into the overhead bin above me. Why hadn't Leo just shipped it? Why did it have to be hand-carried by me? I tried to shake the thought. Mark loved me. We had been together for 3 years. He was the most generous, attentive man I'd ever known. He had literally rescued me from a dead-end job and a mountain of debt. 4 hours into the flight, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, but it wasn't the usual update on weather or arrival time. He sounded strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a minor technical issue and will be making an unscheduled diversion to an intermediate landing strip for a security inspection. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." The cabin lights flickered and then dimmed to a harsh, red emergency glow. A murmur of confusion rippled through the passengers. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. A security inspection? In the middle of the ocean? I looked out the window, but there was nothing but a void of black clouds. Suddenly, the curtain to the first-class cabin was yanked back. 3 men in dark uniforms, their faces obscured by tactical masks, moved down the aisle with terrifying precision. They weren't flight attendants. They didn't look like standard airport security. They looked like a specialized team conducting a high-stakes raid. My breath hitched as they stopped exactly at my row. One of them pointed a gloved finger at the overhead bin where the wooden box was stored. "Maya Thorne?" the lead man asked, his voice muffled by the mask. "Yes," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We have reason to believe you are transporting items involved in an organized scheme to facilitate a grave injustice. You are being detained under a serious accusation of a heavy crime." He reached up, pulled the wooden box from the bin, and placed it on my lap. With a specialized tool, he pried the lid open. My eyes widened, expecting to see a vintage clock. Instead, nestled in velvet, was a complex electronic device wired to several dense packages of a gray, clay-like substance. It wasn't a clock. It wasn't a gift. "Is this yours?" the officer demanded, his voice cold as ice. I looked at the device, then back at the officer, my mind racing to the psychic's words. "The gift is a tether. You will lose your name." Before I could speak, the man flipped the device over, revealing a small engraved plate on the bottom. It didn't have a brand name or a serial number. It had my social security number and a date, today's date, followed by the words, "The Final Sacrifice." Just then, my phone, which was supposed to be in airplane mode, vibrated in my pocket. It was a message from Mark. I glanced at the screen and my blood turned to liquid nitrogen. The message read, "I'm so sorry, Maya. They needed a fall guy and you were the only one I could trust to carry it without questioning." I looked up at the officer, but he wasn't looking at the box anymore. He was looking at the cabin door, which had just been kicked open by another group of men, these ones wearing different uniforms entirely, and they were drawing their weapons. The air in the cabin shattered. Shouts and the metallic clatter of feet on the floorboards replaced the rhythmic hum of the engines. I was caught in the middle of a deadly geometric progression. The first group of men, who claimed to be part of an internal security check, turned their weapons toward the new arrivals. The second group didn't hesitate. They didn't look like law enforcement. They looked like shadows come to life, wearing gray tactical gear with no insignia. "Get down!" the lead officer screamed, lunging for the wooden box. But he was too late. A sharp, high-pitched crack echoed through the pressurized cabin. Not the boom of a traditional firearm, but the clinical snap of a silenced weapon. The officer's shoulder erupted in a spray of red, and he was thrown back against the beverage cart. The passengers erupted into a symphony of screams. I scrambled into the footwell of my seat, my fingers still clutching the phone that held Mark's cold, devastating confession. They needed a fall guy. The words burned in my mind. Mark, the man I'd shared my bed and my secrets with for 3 years, hadn't just betrayed me. He'd orchestrated my destruction with the precision of a watchmaker. The gray-clad men moved with terrifying efficiency. They didn't care about the other passengers. They were there for the box, and they were there for me. I felt a hand seize my collar, dragging me upward. I tried to scream, but a heavy palm was slammed over my mouth, the smell of latex and industrial grease filling my nostrils. "Don't make this harder," a voice whispered in my ear. "The organized scheme only works if you're alive to take the blame." I was dragged toward the rear of the plane, my heels skidding on the carpet. Through the chaos, I saw the internal security team being pinned down. These new men weren't just criminals. They were professionals. They forced me through the galley and toward the emergency exit, which had been breached by a pressurized docking tube that certainly hadn't been there when we took off. We weren't at a normal airport. As they shoved me through the tube, I caught a glimpse of the outside world. We were on a desolate, rain-slicked runway surrounded by dense jungle. No terminal lights, no control tower, just 3 black SUVs idling in the dark. I was thrown into the back of the center vehicle. The wooden box, the gift, was placed on the seat next to me like a passenger. The door slammed shut and the child locks clicked with a finality that made my heart stop. The man in the passenger seat turned around. It wasn't Mark. It was Leo, the partner who had handed me the box at the airport. He looked tired, his expensive suit rumpled, but there was no pity in his eyes. "You really should have listened to that woman at the coffee shop, Maya," he said, tapping a tablet screen. "She has a knack for spotting the doomed." "Where is Mark?" I managed to choke out, my voice sounding like it belonged to a stranger. "What is in this box?" Leo sighed, almost regretfully. "Mark is already in Phuket, playing the grieving fiancé. As far as the world is concerned, you were the lead operative in a group of radicals. This box contains the hardware used to siphon $40 million from a government-held account. It's also rigged with your DNA and digital signature. You're not a victim, Maya. You're the mastermind who died in a tragic struggle during a security intercept." "Died?" I whispered. "But I'm right here." Leo smiled, and it was the coldest thing I'd ever seen. He turned the tablet toward me. A news feed was already scrolling across the screen. My face was there, but the headline beneath it made the world tilt on its axis. "Radical operative Mia Thorne killed in mid-air standoff. Stolen assets recovered." "The world already thinks you're gone," Leo said. "Now, we just have to make the reality match the report. But first, we need your biometrics scan to finalize the last transfer. Mark said you'd be difficult, so he gave us permission to use alternative methods." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, clinical-looking injector. As the SUV began to speed away from the plane and into the dark heart of the jungle, Leo leaned closer, his eyes fixed on my throat. "By the way," he added, his voice dropping to a chilling murmur, "did Mark ever tell you about his first wife? The one who supposedly died in that tragic hiking accident? She had the same emerald ring you're wearing. I wonder if it still fits your finger as well as it did hers." Just as the needle touched my skin, the SUV jolted violently. A massive explosion rocked the ground behind us, and through the rear window I saw the plane, the Silver Bird, erupt into a fireball. But that wasn't the shock. The shock was the face I saw in the side mirror of our car, trailing us on a motorcycle. It was the psychic from the airport, her clouded eyes fixed directly on mine through the glass, and she wasn't laughing anymore. She was holding a remote trigger in her hand. The explosion of the plane sent a concussive wave through the jungle, slamming into our SUV and sending it skidding sideways off the rain-slicked track. Leo's head cracked against the window with a sickening thud, and the injector flew from his hand, sliding across the leather floor. This was it, my one and only chance. I didn't think. I acted on pure, raw adrenaline. I dove for the floor, grabbed the injector, and drove it into Leo's thigh with every ounce of strength I had left. He let out a strangled cry, his eyes bulging as the sedative surged through his system. Within seconds, his grip on the tablet loosened and his head slumped against the headrest. The SUV groaned to a halt. Outside, the psychic, if that's even what she was, slid her motorcycle to a stop just feet from my door. She didn't look like a mystic anymore. She looked like a soldier. She yanked the door open and grabbed my hand, pulling me out into the humid night air. "The plane?" I gasped, looking at the towering pillar of smoke in the distance. "Empty," she said, her voice sharp and devoid of the prophetic rasp. I hacked the manifest and triggered a remote override. The crew and passengers were evacuated into the docking tube before the fuel lines were ignited. It was the only way to make the world believe you were dead and stop the search parties from looking for a survivor. She pulled off her helmet, revealing a face lined with scars and eyes that had seen too much. "My name is Elena. 5 years ago, I was the one sitting in that seat. I was the one Mark chose to be his final sacrifice for a different organized scheme. I didn't die either, but I spent 3 years in a foreign prison under a heavy crime accusation before I could claw my way out. "The box," I said, pointing back at the SUV. "It's a trap. It has my DNA, my signature." "No," Elena said, a grim smile touching her lips. "It's a master key. The emerald ring you're wearing, the gift Mark gave you, it's not just jewelry. It's a biometric transmitter. He wasn't just tracking you. He was using your heartbeat to encrypt the final transfer of those stolen millions. If you die, the money locks. If you're captured, he can trigger a wipe that destroys the evidence, and you with it." She handed me the tablet she'd taken from the unconscious Leo. "But we're going to do something better. We're going to give Mark exactly what he wanted: a ghost." For the next hour, hidden in a small shack at the edge of the jungle, Elena and I worked. She had the technical skills, and I had the biometric key, the ring. We didn't try to stop the transfer. Instead, we rerouted it. We used the final sacrifice device to create a digital trail that didn't lead to me, but directly to Mark's private villa in Phuket. We didn't just move the money. We sent the proof of the entire organized scheme, the records of his previous accidents, and the evidence of his betrayal to the Internal Verification Service. The next morning, I stood on a cliff overlooking the ocean, miles away from the chaos. On the news, the story had changed. Maya Thorne was still officially deceased, but the focus had shifted. A massive raid was underway at a luxury villa in Phuket. I watched the live feed on Elena's phone as Mark was led out in handcuffs, his face pale and contorted with confusion, as the internal verification officers presented him with the wooden box, the very one he'd sent with me. He had tried to build his empire on the lives of women he thought were disposable. He thought he'd found a perfect victim in me, someone who loved him enough to never ask questions. But he forgot one thing: a person who has lost everything, including their name, has nothing left to fear. "What now?" I asked Elena, watching the ring sparkle in the sunlight. "Now you stay dead," she said, handing me a new passport with a name I'd never heard before. "The world is big, Maya, and for the first time in your life, nobody is looking for you." I looked at the emerald ring one last time before tossing it into the dark depths of the ocean below. I wasn't the final sacrifice. I was the one who survived. As the sun rose over the horizon, I realized the psychic's warning hadn't been a curse. It had been an invitation to a new life, one where I was no longer a pawn in someone else's game, but the architect of my own destiny. I turned away from the cliff and walked into the trees, leaving Maya Thorne behind forever.